aquarium. So I said, let me go. And our aquariums in Canada are not like the Baltimore aquarium. You guys have sharks here, right? That's a very exciting thing. And things that are also at the aquarium is the dolphin show, correct? And they have these dolphins, and I was noticing this dolphin, and I saw how loving there's people in charge of the dolphins, right? How loving the dolphin was to them, and how loving they were for the dolphin. And I felt kind of like ghira. You know what ghira is? Ghira is like, when a male has jealousy for his wife, he doesn't want people to talk. I had ghira for the dolphin. And the reason I had the ghira is because I thought that this is a believing dolphin. And these are non-Muslims here, right? And this is not, the love that, like wala wal bara, right? This is an animal that is in complete obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as one of the ulama, he said, he named his book, he named it فَضْلُ الْكِلَابِ عَلَى كَثِيرٍ مِمَّنْ لَبِسَ الثِّيَابِ, which means the virtue of the dogs to many people who wear thobes, who wear clothes. And that was the title of his book, and saying basically in the book that a dog, and even though, Islam, they shouldn't have a dog in their home and so on, that dog, however, if there's a disbelief, suppose like there's a polytheist who's had the truth and rejected it, that dog is more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than that human being. It is. Because the dog is following what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants it to do, and the human being who is blessed with intelligence and then goes against that and disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they then lose their worth. And the virtue comes to those things that mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name and obey Him. In these verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us three characteristics of His subhanahu wa ta'ala. سَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى, the Most High, الَّذِي خَلَقَ فَسَوَّى, the one who created and proportioned. وَالَّذِي قَدَّرَ فَهَدَى, and the one who measured, فَهَدَى, and guided. وَالَّذِي أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى, the one who brings out the pasturage, which is basically like the fruit and vegetables and coming out. In these verses, like the ulama mentioned, الَّذِي خَلَقَ فَسَوَّى, who perfected the creation, قَدَّرَ فَهَدَى, and guided His creation, proportioned it and guided. And they actually mentioned, they'll say, Hidayatullah fil nahl, they'll say the guidance of Allah in the bee. And they'll say, Hidayatullah fil naml, like the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in ants. And they'll go through like a lot of animals. You'll see books like this in the past, where they'll talk about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided His creation. One of the stories they mentioned is and this is mentioned, I think it's Kitab al-Hayawanat by Zamakhshari. And he mentions about this man who was, he took care of birds. He had a home and an attic, and in that attic he had birds, pigeons. And he was taking care of these paraplegic pigeons. They were handicapped and they couldn't fly out, so he would feed them. And he had other birds in his attic that were flying out. They had children. They would go out through the roof, and they would come back and feed their children. So he was taking care of these, and there was the other birds there. So he says that one day this person was arrested by the Khalifa. Like he was just walking in the streets, maybe he had some debts or something, and they picked him off. They said, "Come with us," and they took him to jail. And he was there for many, many days. Actually, weeks went by when he was there in jail. And he said he didn't care about the debt, or he didn't care about being in jail, but his only sadness was that those birds were going to die because there was no one to take care of them. Nobody knew he was in jail. Nobody knew about the birds. His complete sadness was for those birds who had no one to feed them anymore. And so finally, after those weeks went by, he was let go and just walking in his sadness home, waiting for the moment when he would open the door and see his dead birds. And when he opened the door, he saw that not only were the birds, alive, but they had actually gained weight. Right? They became big birds. So he looked at the birds and he was shocked, and he said, what happened here? Nobody knew about the birds being there. And as he sat and he was thinking what had happened here, he noticed the other birds flying in. The other ones, remember there was other birds in the attic. And then he saw that these handicapped birds, they started imitating the children of those birds. So the children would, lift up their head and they would squawk and they'd go, wow, wow, like that. These adult birds started imitating them. And they started squawking like that. The adult birds that could fly, they brought food for their children and they brought food for the other one. And they were feeding them just like they were feeding their own birds. Mouth to mouth, they would give them the food. And he said, subhanAllah, this was an example of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided His creation, and guided the creation of the pigeons. Not all pigeons are, merciful like that. Pigeons can get pretty rough, You think they're all cute and stuff. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 4, وَالَّذِي أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى. And all these things, a person doesn't disbelieve in them. And if you look at just a seed and the plant that comes out from it, who has anything to do with that? We put it in the soil and then we wait for it to come out. And it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, الَّذِي أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى, the one who allows for that plant to come out of the ground. And you'll see in actually a project that an experiment that a lot of kids do in school, is that they'll actually plant something and watch it grow, correct? And you may have done it in your own schools as an experiment. And you'll see the wonder of the children every day coming in and finding their plant a little higher, a little higher. And there's a statement that they say in our culture where they say money doesn't grow on trees, right? But strawberries do. And, not strawberries, right? There's no apples grow on trees. Okay, I apologize. Apples grow on the trees. You have strawberries that grow on bushes, okay? And raspberries. And this is no human being that does this. This is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. الَّذِي أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى فَجَعَلَهُ غُثَاءً أَحْوَى. In verse 5, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives life. Ghutha, if you remember that hadith, which is mentioned in a lot of khutbahs, where when the companion asked the Prophet ﷺ, when everybody will come and eat from the Muslims like one plate, and he said, will that be because we're small in number? And he said, no, it's because you'll be many, but you'll be like ghutha ka ghutha as-sayl, which is the same word here. Ghutha is they'll say the foam and the rubbish of the water, foam and the rubbish. When we were in Egypt, the really nice beaches were the ones that didn't have ghutha, right? When they say Bahamas or something like that, you look at the water and they say, oh, there's no ghutha, so this is good. So here, when the plant comes up and it bears its fruit, like a corn stalk, for example, after you take the corn off and then the people have no need, it dies. Like that stalk will die, obviously not from the plant, but it'll turn into dark stubble and it'll be wasted and blown away. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these are examples that a person sees every single day of the life and death that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives. All of it reminders to the human being that Allah gives life. In verse 6, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سَنُقْرِئُكَ فَلَا تَنْسَى, that we will make you to recite so that you would not forget. Now the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was very afraid because, like we said, he was unlettered. So he couldn't review the Qur'an. It's not like he had it written and he would be practicing his Qur'an like you have people in their taraweeh and so on, reviewing again and again and again. The Prophet ﷺ didn't have that option. And so when Jibreel alayhi salam, this was mentioned by Mujahid al-Kalbi, where he said that when Jibreel would come down to the Prophet ﷺ with revelation, Jibreel alayhi salam would be reciting the verses to the Prophet ﷺ, and before he had completed his the revelation, passing it to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet would start trying to review the first verses so that he wouldn't forget, because he was afraid he would miss some of the verses or get it wrong. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this verse, سَنُقْرِئُكَ فَلَا تَنْسَى, that we would allow you to recite so that you would never forget it. And so the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't forget the Qur'an, and as you see in verse 7, إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ اللَّهِ, except that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. But as the general rule, the Prophet ﷺ would not forget the Qur'an, and he would know it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this was a miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.